Well, good morning from California, but if you're in Washington, D.C. or you're in Mexico, D.C. is good afternoon. My name is Rafael Fernandez de Castro. I'm the director of the Center for U.S. Mexican Studies at the University of California, San Diego. And I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this webinar on U.S.-Mexico security cooperation. We have a very good panel. We have wonderful panelists, and I appreciate your attention to this panel. Let me introduce you with the panelists, and I want to thank you, Banda, Celina, and Cecilia, for being with us. And let me briefly tell you about their bios. Banda Fela Brown is a senior fellow in the Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings Institution. She is the director of the Initiative on Non-State Armed Actors. Among her recent publications are The Fate of Women's Rights in Afghanistan, co-author with Brookings President John Allen. Banda received her doctorate in political science from MIT and her BA in government from Harvard University. Thank you, Banda, for being such a wonderful friend and ally, and I appreciate that you've been in this webinar. We also have Celina Reayulo. She's professor of practice at the William J. Perry Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies at the National Defense University, where she focused on U.S. national security, illicit networks, transnational organized crime, counterterrorism, and threat finance issues in the Americas. Professor Reluyo is a graduate of the Harvard Business School, Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. And Cecilia Farfan leads the research portfolio at the Center for U.S. Mexican Studies. She is the one who leads the security portfolio, as I was explaining to you, and she's an expert on Mexican organized crime and U.S. Mexican security cooperation. Thank you, Cecilia, for organizing this, and we believe this is very timely because just last week we have this high-level meeting on security, Mexico and the U.S. We have a very high-level delegation, and I appreciate you organizing this and inviting Banda and Celina. So let me ask the three of you. Do you think that, I mean, we're talking about a new mechanism of cooperation, Bicentenario. We're not talking about any more the Merida Initiative. Is this a new name? Do you really see important changes in the strategy of cooperation between Mexico and the U.S.? So what is your take on this, Banda?
Well, thank you very much, Rafael, for the invitation. And Cecilia, thank you for also to you for the invitation and organizing the panel. It's terrific to have the conversation among the four of us. Let me give a little bit of a context, Rafael, about the new U.S.-Mexico bicentennial framework for security, public health, and safe communities. The delegation that went to Mexico, the U.S. delegation, came at the time when U.S.-Mexican relations on security issues in particularly have been really in a very difficult, challenging situation, where over the past year, we saw essentially a deep freeze in security cooperation that was probably as close to a critical suspension of cooperation as we have seen any time since the early 1990s. So the fact that the two countries are talking again about security and they are putting a new security cooperation on the table is very important, and it's an important positive step. However, the deep freeze of the past year has deeper roots. The Merida Initiative was really the heyday of cooperation between Mexico and the United States on security matters. It was negotiated during the Felipe Calderón administration. And President Enrique Peña Nieto, who succeeded President Calderón, was already leery about the extent of the cooperation, particularly leery about the extent of the presence of U.S. intelligence and security officials in Mexico suspended elements of the cooperation, such as the Joint Fusions Intelligence Centers, and wasn't that keen on the institutional reforms and the US role in the institutional reforms. And when President López Obrador came to power, from the very beginning, he disliked Mérida and wanted Mérida to end. And that those difficulties with Mérida really came to head when the United States arrested former Secretary of Defense of Mexico, General Salvador Cienfuegos, and then Mexico forced the United States to release him, saying that the US did not have adequate evidence for the drug trafficking charges that it leveled against the general. So there are really substantial differences in what's being negotiated. And let me stress that this is still being negotiated. We have a new name, but we only had first meeting. And the expectation is that sometime perhaps in December, we will actually start seeing some of the details of how some of the core principles are being operationalized. So what are some of the core principles that we know so far? Well, some of them harken back to Mérida. There is a reiteration of shared responsibility. That was the core theme of the Mérida initiative, shared responsibility for security, safety on both sides of the border between the two countries. There is a reiteration of some elements that are of high importance to President López Obrador, such as focus on arms trafficking. Mexico has historically complained that the United States does not do enough to suppress arms trafficking. There is an emphasis on sharing financial intelligence and sharing financial intelligence cooperation efforts. There are, however, also some new themes. They are not altogether new, but they are new in the way that they are being emphasized in the framework, specifically focused on corruption, inequality, and public health. All those existed under Mérida and particularly beyond Mérida, the second iteration of the Mérida initiative that was negotiated between the Obama administration and still the Calderón administration. But those have now become the core components of the framework, or are built as the core components of the framework. I should also say that there is one substantial difference, at least in the way the Mexican administration and the US administration conceive of the security. When Secretary Blinken very positively spoke about his meetings during his press conference, he emphasized joint cooperation on rule of law and law enforcement. Yet clearly the cooperation on law enforcement is something that the López Obrador administration has not been interested in, has essentially eliminated in its relationship with the United States, and has been quite lukewarm to tackle in Mexico itself. And so this is, to me, really the biggest difference. How much of any joint security law enforcement elements will there be left? Or will it be simply all about assistance to those who have substance use disorder and socioeconomic approaches to anti-crime? Will there still be space and crucially need for tackling criminal groups and for helping to strengthen law enforcement institutions in Mexico?
Thank you, Wanda. This is very good. Celina, what is your take on this bicentenary framework? Do you see it as a really a new framework? What are the advantages you see in this, and what are we missing, or what is that you think that we should keep from the Mérida initiative, Celina? And by the way, I mean, you're an expert on the military, and of course, we would like you to tell us, I mean, how you see if those frictions cause because of the detention of General Cienfuegos, do you think that we are over that? We were able to just go beyond that friction? Please, Celina, and thank you for accepting our invitation.
No, thank you all from UCSD for having both Wanda and I who've been looking at these issues, not just in Mexico, but beyond. And she's laid a fantastic groundwork in terms of taking a look at the different aspects. So I look at it more as an evolution, right? So we actually had Mérida, then beyond Mérida, and then now the bicentennial framework, which takes and preserves several aspects of the first two agreements. But what we're seeing is a change of tone, right? So if we think about since the Calderon administration, there was really an emphasis on hard power, which I think Vanda was alluding to in terms of the security perception, and then more importantly, the deployment of resources. As we remember, the Merida Initiative was very heavy on equip and train of the security forces, whether they be the military or the different police agencies throughout Mexico. That's definitely absent. And that was one thing that I was surprised to see last Friday. There's only one reference in the actual published framework that refers to the police. And the way it's actually being seen now is much more emphasis on the corruption piece, but more importantly, the security of our people in terms of drug demand reduction, that addiction is an actual sickness, an illness, as opposed to kind of trying to decriminalize the users, which has been a trend in both the United States and in Mexico as other countries as well for a while. And we've actually seen, for those of us who've been in Washington writing a lot of these different strategies, they love to use things like, so this is, the framework is deemed the 3 Ps, are the 3 pillars, right? So it's protect our people, and then we have prevent transnational organized crime, and then it's basically pursue criminal networks, which I would actually be much more, I would have used a different P, prosecute, right? Which is much more aggressive and much more kind of action oriented. And that's where you've seen, and it actually replaces what had been kind of designed in previous counterterrorism and countercrime strategies in previous administrations, which, if you recall, were called the 4 Ds, right? So it was to actually detect these networks, detain. In the case of terrorist groups, we use the word destroy, dismantle, and then deter or dissuade them. And it was a much more aggressive, much more hard power-based strategy. So that's what you've seen in the tone. Who was notably absent were the representatives of the armed forces on both sides of the border, right? So we actually had Secretary of State, Secretary of Homeland Security, the Attorney General kind of representing the judicial sector, as well as the law enforcement agencies that he supervises, AG Garland. But there was no presence of the Department of Defense, nor the counterparts on the military side. And that was done obviously quite deliberately, as there is this theme of demilitarizing the response to the Mexican cartels. And I see this as a major flaw and a major shortcoming, because if you are going to be in the 3rd pillar, which is to pursue the criminal networks, as also the 2nd one, to actually prevent crime, which is really this objective of lowering the number of homicides and the actual violence, which are enabled by the money and the weapons, and the lack of rule of law, and sadly the reign of impunity and corruption that we see not just in the US and Mexico, but well beyond. I don't really know how you're going to get to the point that you can actually pursue these groups without some sort of the threat of use of violence or the actual use of violence on the part of the states. So this is an area that we're seeing, and many people who have been kind of anticipating this meeting. So I think it's a great opportunity, and we've seen the political will of both sides to sit together at the highest levels to show a commitment, a renewed commitment in our shared interests to combat the flow of drugs and the violence that's associated with it. But the question is, how are you going to get from point A to point B? We have seen a major cooling off, if not actually a break, in bilateral relations in the security space since the arrest of General Cienfuegos. I think it's going to take a very long time to renew that trust that's necessary to do things that we had done in the past, which had been very successful in terms of joint operations. And you also probably recall the new national security law puts a lot of restrictions for American law enforcement agents to be free to operate in Mexico. And I understand many of them are still pending visas to go down and actually be there for a short period of time in order to continue their operations and their investigations, which they now have to get pre-clearance in order to engage with their Mexican counterparts. So that's where I see at a time, and I think Vanda has written quite a bit about this, at a time where we see illicit networks, particularly drug trafficking organizations, the human trafficking, become much more powerful. And this is where the COVID aspect has actually magnified the actual power that these groups wield as they take advantage, sadly, of the rising rates of addiction, particularly in cases of fentanyl, and also the youth at risk. So in Mexico, they talk about the ninis, the young people who are neither studying and neither working. The cartels and the cartelitos have a tremendous workforce that is looking for something to do and looking for income. And this is where the recruitment part is quite disturbing. So the question then is, if we're not empowering the security forces, whether they police or uniform military or the Guardia Nacional, right, the National Guard in Mexico, because they're very absent in the bilateral framework that we've seen. It's not that it's just almost a deliberate decision to kind of take that hard power offer off the table and focus much more on what we call the root causes, which is very in line with the thematics of the Biden foreign policy that we've seen to date.
Thank you, Selena. And Ceci, let me, besides welcome you, I would like to congratulate you because last week you launched a new program, Mapping Criminal Organizations in Mexico, MCO. Tell us a little bit about it. I know that you did very well with media. And my question to you will be, what do you think is the best of the Merida initiative that we should be keeping? And what is the worst of Merida? I'll tell you something. I was working for President Calderon 2008 and 2009. I would say it was very frustrating for him that the resources coming with Merida, I mean, it took very long for us to get all the helicopters, for example. It took really forever. And then on the other side, it was very frustrating for President Obama, especially Merida initiative, what we call it #2, because violence in Mexico was skyrocketing. So it from the start, we have some problems. But so tell us a little bit about your new project, Ceci, and what is your take on Merida, and what you think that this the centennial framework should be taking and making sure that they kept from Merida.
Sure. Thank you, Rafael, and thank you for, it's great to have this conversation with great colleagues and friends, and thank you for the opportunity to just talk about mapping criminal organizations. It's really a project that started out of need. I mean, the basic question of where do criminal groups operate in Mexico, we need to answer that in order to answer other questions that are of interest to public policy as well as research. And we didn't really have reliable public data on that. So based on this need that several researchers had from different disciplines, we have economists, political scientists, historians, we really got together to try to put out this data. And so this is the result of a lot of hard work for a number of years. We have more releases coming. We have the municipal data coming up as well. And so it's really an invitation also to think collectively. This is one of the big reasons to make the data set public and make our methodology very transparent, just to encourage everyone to think about the hard questions about violence in Mexico by having data in order to answer those questions. So I'll stop there with MCO because I could, spend a whole lot longer talking about that. In terms of Merida, I just want to say that I echo what Selena and Vanda were saying. I think that I applaud the fact that after this very complicated, strained year, and in fact, as Vanda was telling, a number of years where this cooperation had been going through some bumps, that we have, now we have a dialogue that has been reactivated, and at least there's political will on both sides. So I think that's certainly a good sign. I also agree that there's a lot of the language of Merida that this bicentennial framework takes on again. And I've called it a little bit of a rebranding, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I actually mean it in like, okay, this is a new administration, they want to put their stamp on things, but I think it's fantastic to see that this idea of shared responsibility still is there, because we had not seen it in public discourse for a while coming out of Mexico. There was a lot, for a while for a little period there, we saw a very nationalistic discourse of respecting sovereignty, of, non-intervention, and to see, that this shared responsibility is taken up in the bicentennial framework, I think it's a great sign. I think it's also very good, as Vanda and Selena were alluding to, that we see different language related to drug use. So a lot of the spirit of cooperation between the US and Mexico for a very long period of time, it was really focused on narcotics. And so to see an evolution and talk about drug users and how that represents a health problem and not a criminal problem, I think that's important. Now, certainly, I think, as Selena was pointed out, the details is is really what matters. And what we're expecting to see here are resources going to these services that can actually target these problems of substance use disorders. And I mean, certainly for us at the border, we see it more clearly that people who live in Mexico City. And so we know that drug use in Mexico is also increasing. So this is not only about the US, but very much a need for both countries. I think one of the challenges that we've had with Merida, and that, you know, it's not clear for me that the bicentennial framework is going to go in that direction, but I hopefully would like to see that, is really incorporating the subnational level a lot more. These are dialogues that are happening still a lot at the federal level. And of course, there's reasons for that, but I think there's a lot of space for working at the subnational level. And to the extent that that could happen, I think we would have interventions that are more effective rather than thinking of these sort of like big milestones or big objectives. And so I would certainly like to see the US getting involved in the subnational level a lot more than they have done. I understand their security protocols and why they don't necessarily always, you know, engage at the subnational level, but I think there's definitely potential and space for doing that. I think, and I will finish my comment with this, in general, I think having this dialogue is very, very good for both countries for different reasons. I think on the hand of the US, what we have seen is, even with Merida, there's still a big sense and perception that a lot of cooperation in Mexico happens contingent on personalities. And if you're going to talk about regional security, I think it's very problematic that your partner thinks that it depends on who is in charge rather than you having an institutional framework. I think for the Mexican side, having this kind of dialogue helps manage the asymmetry that is intrinsic to the US-Mexico relationship, and also provides some certainties about how you can engage the US in these topics that are of interest to both countries. So I'll stop there for this first round. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. I must say that Michael Lettieri, a senior fellow at the center, he's also done a wonderful work in launching this initiative. So thank you, Michael. And he is using the Q&A. And I would like to remind all of you that you could send questions to us. I would like to do this as interactive as possible. There's a Q&A feature there. Please send us your questions. And Michael is asking us, Wanda and Selena, how is the Guardia Nacional seen in Washington? But I will also, let me, Wanda and Selena, share an anecdote with you. I remember that we were getting ready. I was working for President Calderon, and we were getting ready to come visit President Obama. This was early May 2010. And things were not going that well in Mexico. Actually, violence was skyrocketing. We were having some problems with Merida. Again, the resources were coming late. And suddenly we were having an argument with the Secretary of Gobernación and a few others. And I remember that President Calderon said, wait, stop. If I were going to ask President Obama for only one thing to improve U.S.-Mexico cooperation, what that issue should be, what should be my take, my ask on Obama? May I ask you that, Wanda? I mean, what is the single most important thing that U.S. could do to improve security in Mexico, to improve U.S.-Mexico cooperation? And let me ask you, Selena, as well. And I would also like you to, I mean, we all know that last year, it was an awful year for the U.S. because there were close to 100,000 people who died because, mostly because of opioids overdose, but also crystal and a few other substances. So I wonder, I mean, how that plays in U.S.-Mexico cooperation. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the goals. Seems to me that we have always had problems in aligning the goals. What is in it for the U.S.? What is in it for Mexico? We know that the DEA is about the drug lords. Let me ask you, Wanda, I mean, what is, if I were Santa Claus, what would you ask the U.S. administration? What is the number one thing we need out of the U.S. to improve this cooperation and to improve security in Mexico?
Oh, thank you. So there are very many questions on the table. What is the most important element? The question of the National Guard that I would like to come to, and also the questions of opioids. let me actually say that the most important thing that can happen with respect to violence and security in Mexico is that the López Obrador administration starts prioritizing that issue and comes to realize that it will need to deploy effective law enforcement. That as long as Mexican law enforcement forces do not have deterrence capacity, violence will persist. And it's not going to be just violence about drugs, as it is not anymore just about drugs. It's going to be about avocados and migrants and women and petty robbery and other forms of violent crime. To me, that's really far more fundamental, finding the political will in Mexico and sustaining it, which brings me to the issue of the Guardia Nacional, the National Guard. I mean, one of the really challenging issues in Mexico is that essentially every administration that has come in has, since the 1980s, has dismantled prior law enforcement institutions, finding them corrupt or inadequate, and started a new one. Before the Guardia Nacional, President Enrique Peña Nieto had, of course, the gendarmerie, which essentially withered since. So with the Guardia Nacional, we just see yet another reshuffling and relabeling of law enforcement apparatus in Mexico, heavily militarized, continuing the militarization. We see quite weak and inadequate pursuit of police reform, both at the national level and at the municipal level. But I think the US can contribute most is with helping Mexico with institutional reform, with police reform. But it's something that Mexico needs to want, and it has not wanted it. When President López Obrador has started the National Guard, the United States offered assistance in terms of institution building, rule of law efforts, and President López Obrador said, no, thank you very much, I'm not interested, and has maintained that line since. And worse than that, not only was the federal police dismantled, the way it was dismantled essentially just burned years of efforts and substantial amounts of resources that have been put into building the federales. They were hardly perfect. There was corruption, there were still deficiencies, but in comparison to other law enforcement forces in Mexico, civilian law enforcement forces, they were by far the most advanced, and it was really tragic to see them just torn apart, not simply as an institution, but the way that individual units were torn apart and folded into the Guardia Nacional. So I think the United States is interested very much in collaborating with Mexico on building effective law enforcement institutions with deterrence, and collaborating with institutional development of the Guardia Nacional. And yet it remains to be seen whether the new framework will allow President López Obrador to have any interest in that component. Because yes, some of the language is similar to Merida, but there is a real palpable difference in emphasis. And what I really worry is that the law enforcement element will be underemphasized because the Mexican government is simply not interested in it. I would like to make just a few comments about the overdose that we are seeing in the United States. So the US is experiencing for a number of years the worst drug epidemic ever in history. Just last year, 93,000 Americans died as a result of opioid-related overdose. This is a number that has been rising steadily year after year since about 2011. The crisis originated in the legal drug market, pharmaceutical prescription opioids that were overprescribed as a result of egregious deception of pharmaceutical companies in the United States that claimed that the drugs were not addictive, but they were vastly addictive. And it went through several mutations and ultimately ended up featuring the synthetic opioids produced in China and India, fentanyl and its precursor agents that are smuggled either in their finished element or as the precursor agents into Mexico where they are produced. And we have since seen a really dramatic spread of fentanyl and fentanyl-based products, not just geographically in the United States, in Canada, and increasingly in Mexico, but we are also seeing them being mixed with methamphetamine, with cocaine. A lot of other drugs today feature some component of fentanyl, with devastating consequences for overdose. The potency is such that overdose is very easy, and the potency is such that it's very easy for drug traffickers to smuggle those substances. And the latest phase is really a big expansion of fake prescription pills that are manufactured in Mexico that are heavily based on fentanyl. Sometimes they are pure fentanyl, even though they are labeled oxycodone, for example. Sometimes it's a mixture of fentanyl and something else. And this is not something that can simply be addressed through the provision of safe needles. Which incidentally, the López Obrador administration just defunded in Mexico. Very bad decision. It's not something that can simply be addressed through the provision of overdose reversing medication like Naloxone. Very important component, but not simply enough. There needs to be will in Mexico to tackle the traffic and to tackle the drug trafficking organizations that spread. So Sinaloa Cartel, but also Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. Just as the United States needs to shape its law enforcement policies to help bring homicide rates down, something that right now is really not even a factor, as the United States has no direct role or even indirect role in any kind of law enforcement designed on the ground. And the Mexican government has more or less walked away from any kind of confrontation with the drug trafficking groups. Just as the US has responsibility for thinking about violence in Mexico, Mexico has responsibility for tackling the traffic that's killing Americans. And I hope that later on we can talk about the new policies in Michoacan and whether that's a signal or not of perhaps some changes and the promised focus on the 50 most violent municipalities in Mexico.
We'll come to it, Vanda. Let me go to Selena. Selena, we have a few questions here in the Q&A. Our dear friend Claire Selke, that we all know that she's very knowledgeable about the Merit Initiative. She's at the CRS. She's asking us, do you think the US Congress will continue funding? And then we have also Javier Brown. He's at the Mexican Senate. He's the head of the staff of the North American Committee. And he's asking us, talking about the subnational level, do you think that the new framework could have some concrete results if it not emphasizes the necessity of fostering local police forces? And please, Alina, what is your take on all of this?
Sure. So I actually agree, and more importantly, share the concerns that Vanda has about the lack of emphasis of law enforcement, because that's really the only way you can, counter the transnational criminal organizations, and then more importantly, dismantle them. And we've seen, as you all remember, in 2011, we changed the name of drug trafficking organizations in U.S. foreign policy and the national strategy to combat transnational organized crime, acknowledging that these groups are not just focused on narcotics. They're actually engaged in all types of illicit activities that are just as lucrative. And sadly, too, with the effects of globalization, all these traditional activities, whether it's arms, drug, human trafficking, contraband, have always been actually accelerated and magnified in terms of also the wealth, and sadly, in the Americas, the violence that accompanies these activities. So if we take a look at violence reduction, and then in the case of the US, in terms of our interests, the reduction of supply of drugs into the US market, probably you had asked that first question, like what would be on the wish list, right? I think the reduction of the demand for drugs. We just had, I think it was yesterday, Guatemalan President John Matei, while speaking in Colombia, basically pointed the finger to the US as the #1 consumer of drugs, right? As well as the #1 launderer and exporting dirty money. So this is where this shared responsibility is real. But on the US side, we need to really address the trying to deal with demand reduction. And answering what we've been trying to do, as you all know, I sit at National Defense University, but we take a look at trying to engage and do briefings for our congressional delegations, is try to have people understand in the United States that individual consumption of drugs is directly linked to the violence that's happening in Mexico that could also happen in our communities. And this is not as emphasized as in other places. And this is something that we need to really kind of think about. When we're looking at, and this is why I think the criticism of the bicentennial framework is it means well, it sounds good, it was a fabulous photo opportunity diplomatically, but where's the beef? And I think this is the question. And I was quite struck, and I think I mentioned before, how few references there were to police and law enforcement in the part of preventing transnational organized crime and then prosecuting and pursuing them, because without the boots on the ground to actually confront and then more importantly arrest these people, the whole plan has actually no teeth. And we have in the past, so as you know, I worked with you very closely during the Calderon administration, and we were going down to Mexico probably every 2 months and working at the state level. Spent a lot of time in Jalisco working with the different police agencies who had specific requests, and we're not seeing that. And that's the same true is the offers are on the table, but we have not seen the AMLO administration take up offers of institution building, whether it be with the military, the different police forces, and the Guardia Nacional, the National Guard. We work a little bit more with them on the issue of migration, which we haven't touched yet during the conversation, in terms of border security, helping with surveillance, equipment, and techniques on the southern border of Mexico. But it's an area that could be enhanced in terms of that bilateral cooperation. And I think what we're trying to see is how to get congressional leaders who are actually campaigning in the midterms, which will be next year, and realizing how destructive the opioid epidemic is in each of their communities, to pay more attention to Mexico and the U.S. Mexican relationship, because it's not a problem that they're intertwined. And more importantly, we see like West Virginia and parts of New England are particularly, have always traditionally been hit by the opioid epidemic, but even more so. And as we come out of the pandemic and there's more access to points of sale, you're actually we anticipate there's gonna be even higher levels of addiction as we've underestimated the mental health impact of isolation during the pandemic.
Thank you, Selena. I have, there's a lot of questions, and Andrew Rodman from the Wilson Center, and thank you, Andrew, for being with us. He's asking us, while all panelists stress the importance of continued dialogue, which I share, could the bicentennial understanding be characterized as too many hugs, not enough bullets? I'll ask you, Cecilia. And Claire Silk, she's asking us again, she's telling us the House bill will prohibit funding for the National Guard. Thank you, Claire, for letting us know that. Cecilia, what is your take? What do we really need out of the U.S.? Selena and Banda, they talking about the importance of this deterrence capacity. I wonder, Ceci, because Calderon tried to increase the deterrence capacity, and in a way, violence skyrocketed. In principle, I like the idea of López Obrador to go holistic, but would you tell us? And then, Banda, would you like to react to something that Selena just said?
Well, after Ceci has a chance to answer, I would like to come to Andrew Rodman's questions about too many hugs and not enough bullets.
Excellent. Go ahead, Ceci.
Thank you. Before I answer your question, I just want to complement what Selena and Banda were talking about the opioid epidemic. And I think this is a good opportunity to highlight one of the first task forces that you and I put together, the U.S. Mexico Security Cooperation Task Force. Banda was one of the proponents, and we discussed it as a group of having a fentanyl interdiction task force. And we have often stress this to the Mexican government as a low-cost, high reward move on their part to show that we care about the laws on the other side of the border. And I think in light of the Mexican government lawsuit against U.S. gun manufacturers, where we're asking them to care about the tremendous loss of life that illegal gun trafficking causes in Mexico, that would be a great opportunity to show, we care about fentanyl and how it's going into the U.S. So once again, I think that task force, there's potential there, and there's a lot of bonus points that the Mexican government could get out of that. In terms of the military, I think I agree with you that we have seen not law enforcement necessarily, or these militarized strategies specifically succeed in the case of Mexico. And so what I would like to stress, and what I like about this bicentennial framework, and I will differ a little bit from Vanda and Selena, is really seeing the emphasis on other types of capacity building. So I think, for example, programs that have been focused on training judges, I think that has probably a longer term benefit and impact than trying to keep pursuing these heavy law enforcement strategies that we have not necessarily seen. However, I do agree with Vanda that the problem is that we keep trying to reinvent the wheel every 6 years in Mexico, and so lessons learned and institutional memory of security institutions is just not there. And so I think that has really decreased the ability of the Mexican government, both at the federal level and local level, to really do something about it. More importantly, I do think that the US is waiting for Mexico to show that it cares about corruption. And this has been something that they have been waiting for years. And with this administration and the platform that López Obrador ran on, I think the expectation was that we were going to see some high profile cases. And to this day, we have not seen that. But I appreciate that perhaps, on the US side, it's seen as there's not enough emphasis on law enforcement. I think one of the things that does come out of the bicentennial framework is talking about more extraditions. The Mexican side feels it already extradites a lot of people. The US feels it's not enough. I think this is a happy medium. So to me right now, how I see it, and of course, bearing in mind that they're still working out the details, I wrote about the U.S.-Mexico relationship as if it were a baseball game. And so I refer, before this dialogue, as a security conversation being on deck, waiting to see what pitches were coming. And so I think right now we're on first base. And of course, there's a long way to go before there's, a run that's scored. But I think, again, this is a good first step. There's a lot that remains to be hashed out between both countries, but I'm not necessarily too concerned about the lack of law enforcement as Selena and Vanda are.
Thank you, Ceci. Vanda and Selena, if you think Cecilia is knowledgeable about security, just don't talk to her about baseball because she's a true expert on football as well. I can tell that you can make these comparisons. Go ahead, Vanda. You wanted to answer.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to take on Andrew's questions. Too many hugs and not enough bullets, which actually nicely connects with Ceci's comments here, ending with the law enforcement component. Clearly, the strategy that focused heavily on so-called high-value targeting, namely arrests of the capo without the ability really to dismantle much of the middle operational layer of the criminal groups, amplified violence. Was not the sole reason for violence. The most important one was that criminal groups in Mexico have not been afraid of either federal forces, military or police in particular, let alone state and municipal forces. But the high value targeting that led to fragmentation in the absence of the state coming in with effective presence, multifaceted presence, but certainly one that could deter violence, never materialized. And so walking away from high value targeting and thinking about other law enforcement strategies, such as middle layer targeting, was a very appropriate move. Sadly, I don't see that in Mexico. And it's not just in the framework. We are just in the initial step. We just had the first high-level conversation. Obviously, there were working group meetings prior to that high-level delegation. But the details where the angel and the devil lie are yet to be worked out, and we'll be seeing hopefully more in the months. But we can talk about what we see in Mexico, which is not just not bullets, in my view, also highly inappropriate hugs. So the Mexican government has essentially stepped, with the exception of this new plan in Michoacan, where President López Obrador seems to have deployed several thousand of soldiers, Guardia Nacional personnel into Michoacan last week. Until that moment, he has essentially stepped from confronting DTOs, criminal groups with violence, even when they showed up, the highest Mexico City security officials in the middle of the F, when they were trying to take before that over entire municipality in ways that many insurgents wouldn't do in such a brazen manner. Even when they were shooting up police stations, the overwhelming notion was do not use force. And the president repeatedly applauded the forces standing by, watching violence, and essentially not responding to it. So the bullets have been missing. And the bullet here is really a shorthand, of course, for both effectively stepping and stopping violence and prosecuting criminals. But the hugs, in my view, have also been problematic. There has been way too much coddling of the criminal groups. The President López Obrador's response to the level of intimidation and violence that the cartels and other criminal groups deployed during the electoral period has been very disconcerting. And the words that he used when those issues were pointed out are very disconcerting, essentially given carte blanche. And to the extent that the socioeconomic components, the hugs, have been part of his efforts, something that he emphasized very much in order to address root causes, and something that the framework reiterates, that's very important. And it's something that I was advocating during the Calderon years, and that was embedded in the Pillar 4 of Beyond Merida, building resilient communities, was all about deploying socioeconomic anti-crime policies. But they have to be well-targeted and well-designed. And I don't see that during the López Obrador administration. I see sort of blanket, questionable, general approaches of any kind of vocational training will inevitably result in crime declining. I would doubt that's the case. Or notions that planting monocrop plantations, planting trees as sort of monocropping plantations will somehow insulate farmers from either joining crime or being exposed to violence by criminal groups. Again, very questionable proposition. So the socioeconomic elements are very important, and they need to be part of a state's response to violent criminality. But they need to also be well designed, well monitored, and there needs to be some theory about what specific program is going to, in what specific way, affect crime. And I don't see that. I see sort of general throwing of kind of broad handouts, economic handouts, often directly from the president, going around institution or even dismantling institution, but and more broadly, very significant very significant emphasis on reducing institutions in Mexico as more direct handouts. And so it's not just that there's not enough bullets. The hugs, in my view, are very problematic in the way they're designed.
Thank you, Wanda. I'm sure that Selena and Cecilia, you want to say something about it. But let me ask you, I mean, we have 10 minutes to go, and there's two questions that I wanted to ask you. First of all, there has been an increase in gender violence all over the world, in the US, I mean, because of the emergency situation. But in Mexico, on top of it, there has been, I believe, a disconnect between the government of López Obrador and the gender movement and these women affected by violence. So I wonder, I mean, how you see that. And the other one, the other question, Celine, is I believe that President Calderon and Andrés Manuel López Obrador, they have made a lot of emphasis in trying to stop and trying to tell the US, please stop arms smuggling into Mexico. Does it make sense to you? I remember telling President Calderon, see how Obama sometimes even cry out of desperation because, I mean, he cannot really stop all of these shootings, massive shootings in the US, because there's a big problem about arms in the US. So what is your take on this? Do you think that Mexico could be effective in asking the U.S. to reduce the flow of arms into Mexico when the U.S. has a huge domestic problem? Cecilia, Ceci, and Banda.
So let's take a look at the question of guns, which has been a perennial since the beginning of the Merida Initiative, right? Because the violence is a result. So criminal groups, as we call them, armed groups, which have different political motivations when we talk about insurgencies or terrorist groups, they need weapons in order to use the threat of violence or actual violence to promote their agendas, right? Their nefarious agendas. And obviously to control territory, and then more importantly, to ward off the rivals. That's where you've seen this type of violence. I'm sad to say that in our country, in the United States, this year we're on track to have huge homicides due to guns. Every weekend goes by that we have large cities, and there sadly are many children who are victims of this rampant gun violence. And when we take a look at what's happening and why that's taking place here in Washington, D.C. or in Chicago, which is notorious, a lot of it is also gang related, right? So these are not things that happen only in one country, but also the access to weapons in the U.S. is quite prolific. It's quite easy to gain access. And what we've seen, because again, we've had attempted school shootings with just the schools back in session for about 4 weeks, it's a reminder of what was happening pre-pandemic. So there are going to be calls for more regulation, more know your customer in terms of straw purchases, which could have a positive impact. And we did see arms trafficking as a discrete line of effort, right, in the new bicentennial framework, just as also human trafficking, human smuggling were included as another area, even though a lot of the emphasis was on drug trafficking in the framework. So the question then is, how are we controlling? So normally every year I go to Nogales, Arizona to do a field study. This year we weren't able to go because of COVID. And then we actually run the test about, if we're going to actually be detained or checked in terms of what's in our trunk or in the SUV when we're outbound from the US to Mexico. We're never checked. And this is the problem, why we have tons of dirty money and weapons that are crossing the border, because the constraints and the controls are not the same on each side of the border. So that's an area that could be of collaboration. So it's an important piece. You were talking about violence against women. I'm just about to finish publications about the role of women in transnational criminal organizations. Las Narcas, as you guys know, we're going to have a whole series now on Netflix of the Narcas instead of the Narcos. And then more importantly, looking at the role of women, not just as victims of crime, but actually the ones who are starting to lead criminal organizations, because they're less perceived as a threat, which is a very interesting way to use women asymmetrically, whether we're talking about different Central American gangs or different drug trafficking organizations. But I am quite appalled, and still it pains me to see the year-on-year increase of violence against women, particularly in the Americas, and particularly during the pandemic, because these women had no recourse during the pandemic. And then more importantly, they're so dependent on their partner for subsistence that these women continue to be in very hostile relationships, and there's no way for them to escape. What I also am sad about is the fact that in many countries, it's still not recognized. We have reports that we issue, it's just still not taken as seriously as it should. And the numbers are actually validating, the increase in numbers are validating the epidemic that is violence against women. So there's a couple of ways that we're trying to address it, which is awareness, right? To actually understand the cycle of violence in the household. And then more importantly, how can these women who are the victims, and children as well, by the way, reach out? And this is where it's so important. As you know, at the Perry Center, we have a program on women, peace, and security, where we're encouraging, trying to reach that 20% number of women in both the military and the police, who will better understand. And also it's easier to approach a woman who is victimized. It's easier for her to approach a female police officer or a female security official in order to explain. And then more importantly, that it's not just empathy, but it's the idea that you'll be taken seriously. And I think that's an area that has to be, or need to raise awareness in the United States and also across Latin America, because domestic violence is a reality. It just hasn't really reached the level that it needs to reach in order for us to actually address and change that curve for a decline in femicides.
Thank you, Selena. Cecilia, what is your take on these questions? And if you want to say a last message, because we're about to close.
Sure. I think on the question of gender violence, I mean, if this idea of safer communities, as it is laid out on the bicentennial framework, is something that both governments take seriously, then the question of violence against women really fits into that. And so if we're going to really construct safer communities, then undeniably we have to look at the differential impacts that violence has on different groups. So not only women, but different age groups, men, rural versus urban spaces. And so I think there's definitely a space for there to construct. I think building on what Selena was mentioning about thinking also about women who are criminals, I think it really, again, in this context of safer communities, what we should really be thinking about is a complexity that oftentimes you have victims and perpetrators, and they're not mutually exclusive categories. And so going forward, as we try to think about how these communities need to look like, that's something that we definitely need to consider. And of course, I echo Selena's point about representation in the criminal justice system. I think that is crucial. And again, I think going back to questions about capacity building, that is also an area of an opportunity where Mexico and the U.S. could work together of thinking about what these institutions need to look like to really reflect the societies that they prefer to serve. So I'll finish there, and I'll thank you everyone for joining us today, and of course, Rafael, for helping us put this webinar together.
Thank you, Ceci. Vanda, your last take on this.
Thank you. I would just add sort of one elaboration on the issue that was raised about subnational level cooperation, which Ceci spoke about, and it's certainly very important. And I think there are a lot of opportunities. It's not a new idea. There were repeated efforts and sometimes quite robust efforts, such as between the United States and Chihuahua. Unfortunately, the reality of the national security law that Selena spoke about, that was passed in December of last year, is such that no such cooperation is possible. In fact, really no such cooperation is possible even at the federal level in the absence of very strict pre-clearing that really hampers and eviscerates any kind of meaningful cooperation. And we have seen the presence and ability of U.S. law enforcement officials in Mexico to even just come along on an operation collapse. And so I hope that the framework will allow the resurrection of cooperation, both at the federal and sub-federal level, in institution building, in law enforcement operations, to be able to take place, and also enable it at the level of building municipal police forces and really resurrecting and cleaning up municipal police forces, in addition to thinking how the federal policing will take place in a way that can ease its way away from the heavy emphasis on military forces and at the same time create deterrence. Thank you, Rafael, and thank you, Cecilia and Selena, for a terrific conversation.
Oh, thank you, Vanda, and thank you, Selena, and thank you, Cecilia, for this wonderful conversation. I mean, it's been only 1 week since Mexico and the US launched this bicentennial framework. So why don't we say that in 6 months from now, let's say early June, we'll have another webinar, and we'll try to assess what is this, how is this working? And then I believe by then, hopefully Claire Silke already wrote a report for the Congressional Research Service, so we could invite her and comment on her report. Thank you very much for being with us. Again, thank you, Vanda Bella Brown. Thank you, Cecilia Reayulo, and thank you, Cecilia Farfán. Hasta luego. Thanks a lot, and thank you all for being with us. Thank you.